March 4th, 1944. Before dawn. RAF Debden, Eastern England. The airfield is silent except for the wind. Frost coats the grass. A single engine coughs, then catches, its sound tearing through the darkness. Another follows, then another. Under the wing of a P-51 Mustang, a crew chief finishes his last inspection and steps back. There's nothing more he can do now. If something has been missed, no one will know until the engine goes quiet. 600 miles from home. Today, American fighters are flying farther than they ever have before, past the point where escorts always turn back, past the margin for error, all the way to Berlin. This mission does not depend on courage, it depends on numbers, fuel burn, distance, minutes in the air. If the calculations are wrong, if a tank fails to feed, if a switch is thrown too late, these pilots won't be shot down. They'll simply run out of fuel over Germany and fall out of the sky. As the Mustangs begin to roll toward the runway, every man involved understands the truth. By nightfall, the math will either work, or it will kill them. Berlin was not just another target on a map. It sat deep inside Germany, nearly 600 miles from the English coast, farther than any American fighter escort had ever gone and returned. Long before a bomber reached the city, the problem had already begun to solve itself. Fuel gauges falling, margins shrinking, escorts forced to turn back. For German air defenses, Berlin was the safest place in the Reich. The city was ringed with anti-aircraft guns, layered belts of flak batteries calibrated by altitude and speed. Radar stations tracked incoming formations from the moment they crossed the coast. Fighter bases surrounded the capital, their aircraft fueled, armed, and waiting. But none of that was the real protection. Distance was. American bombers had tried to reach Berlin before. They went in daylight, flying exactly as doctrine demanded, tight formations, straight and level, trusting in overlapping machine gun fire to keep enemy fighters at bay. The theory said it would work. Reality said otherwise. Once the escorts peeled away to conserve fuel, the bombers were alone. German fighters waited for that moment. Then they attacked with precision and brutality, head-on passes at closing speeds so high that a mistake meant instant death. Cannon shells ripped through cockpits and wings, aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, crews bailed out over occupied Europe, knowing captivity was the best outcome they could hope for. Some didn't even make it that far. Losses climbed into the dozens on single missions. Entire formations came back riddled with holes or didn't come back at all. The bombers followed the rules. They flew the formations. They trusted the doctrine. They died anyway. By late 1943, Berlin had become the symbol of that failure. Every mile closer to the city meant fewer escorts, more German fighters, and a steeper price in lives. The message was clear to everyone involved in the air war. American bombers could reach Berlin, American fighters could not stay there. And as long as that remained true, Berlin was forbidden, not by fear, but by physics. The American bomber offensive was built on a promise. Fly in tight formation, concentrate defensive fire. Overlapping machine guns would create a moving fortress, one so dangerous that enemy fighters could not penetrate it. Numbers would replace maneuver, discipline would replace speed. On paper, it was sound. In the air, it failed. German fighter pilots learned quickly that they did not need to destroy the formation. They only needed to wait. American escorts could not stay with the bombers forever. Fuel gauges always decided the moment. When the fighters turned back, the bombers kept going. Straight, predictable, and alone. That was the escort gap. It appeared at the same point on every deep mission, like a clockwork trap. One moment, American fighters filled the sky above the bombers. The next, they were gone. The Luftwaffe watched and waited for that exact transition. Then, they attacked. They came in head-on where bomber gunners had seconds to react. Closing speeds reached 600 miles per hour. A single burst from a 20mm cannon could tear a cockpit apart. A single hit in the wing could turn an aircraft into a falling torch. Once a bomber dropped out of formation, it was finished. German fighters swarmed the stragglers, picking them apart until nothing remained but smoke and debris spiraling toward the ground. Crews knew the rules: stay in formation or die. But damaged aircraft could not keep up. Engines failed, control surfaces jammed. The formation moved on because it had to. Some missions lost dozens of bombers in a single day. The most disciplined crews in the world followed doctrine perfectly and paid for it with their lives. By the end of 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. The bombers were not being defeated over the target. They were being defeated on the way there and on the way home, in the empty sky where escorts no longer existed. As long as that gap remained, the outcome was already decided before the first bomb was dropped. The bomber war could not be won unless American fighters could do something they had never done before. The aircraft that offered a way out of this trap did not arrive with fanfare. It wasn't faster than everything else. It wasn't more heavily armed. And when it first appeared, few believed it would matter. The P-51 Mustang had been flying since 1942, but early versions were built for a different kind of war. At low altitude, it was fast and agile. At high altitude, where the bomber battles were fought, it struggled. Its engine simply couldn't breathe well enough in thin air. That changed when the Mustang received a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. With a two-stage supercharger, the Merlin gave the aircraft power where it mattered most. At 20 and 30,000 feet, the Mustang could climb, accelerate, and fight on equal terms with German interceptors. It could finally stay where the bombers were. But performance alone wasn't enough. The real breakthrough was range. The Mustang carried fuel in its wings and later in a tank behind the pilot's seat. With external drop tanks mounted under the wings, the aircraft could theoretically escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The word theoretically mattered. No American fighter had ever attempted this profile before. The fuel system demanded perfect discipline. Pilots had to burn fuel in the correct order, switch tanks at precise moments, and drop the external tanks before combat. A mistake could make the aircraft unstable or leave fuel stranded where it couldn't be used. The drop tanks themselves were disposable. Some were made of pressed paper, never meant to last more than a few hours before they began to leak. They were a temporary solution to a permanent problem. If everything worked, the Mustang could change the war. If it didn't, dozens of pilots would run out of fuel deep inside Germany. No one had proven which outcome was more likely. That question would be answered today. The failure of American fighter escort was not a mystery. It was a math problem that never balanced. Every fighter aircraft flying from England faced the same limitation. Fuel had to cover the climb to altitude, the long cruise across enemy territory, time spent in combat, and the return trip home. There was no reserve for mistakes, no margin for bad weather, detours, or prolonged fighting. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the backbone of American fighter forces in Europe. It was fast in a dive, heavily armed, and strong enough to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Pilots trusted it, they survived in it. But it drank fuel. Even with external drop tanks, the Thunderbolt's combat radius fell hundreds of miles short of Berlin. Escort missions forced pilots to make the same decision every time: turn back on schedule or risk not making it home at all. The bombers flew on without them. The P-38 Lightning seemed like the answer. Twin engines, long range. On paper, it could reach deep targets in Germany. In practice, it was never available in sufficient numbers. Many Lightnings were sent to the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, where their range was desperately needed. Those that did fly over Europe suffered in the cold, thin air at altitude. Engines faltered, cockpits froze, pilots fought their aircraft as much as the enemy. So the escorts always peeled away. It didn't matter how aggressive the pilots were or how badly they wanted to stay. Fuel gauges did not respond to determination. Once the needles dropped too far, the decision was made for them. German commanders understood this better than anyone. They knew exactly where the escorts would turn back. They plotted their intercepts around that moment, timing attacks for the stretch of sky where bombers had no protection. The Luftwaffe didn't need to win every fight. They only needed to exploit the gap. As long as American fighters were forced to leave early, Berlin remained safe, not because it couldn't be reached, but because nothing could stay there long enough to matter. The solution to the escort problem was not elegant. It did not come from a breakthrough in aerodynamics or a revolutionary new engine. There was no dramatic redesign, no secret weapon hidden behind layers of classification. It was fuel. More of it. The P-51 Mustang already carried fuel in its wings, and later, in a tank behind the pilot's seat. That alone gave it better range than most American fighters, but even that was not enough to reach Berlin, fight, and return safely. So engineers added external drop tanks under the wings. They were crude, disposable. Some were made of pressed paper and glue, shaped over wooden molds by companies that normally manufactured cardboard containers. They were never intended to survive combat or weather long-term exposure. They only needed to work for a few hours. That was enough. With the drop tanks attached, the Mustang could carry hundreds of additional gallons of fuel. In theory, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, remain over the target, and still have enough fuel to reach England again. In practice, the system demanded absolute precision. Pilots had to burn fuel in a strict sequence: wing tanks during takeoff and climb, then the fuselage tank, then the external tanks, saving internal fuel for combat and the return flight. Switch too early or too late, and fuel could become unusable. Forget to drop the empty tanks before fighting, and the aircraft's performance suffered at the worst possible moment. The fuselage tank posed its own danger. When full, it shifted the aircraft's center of gravity, making it unstable in combat. Manuals warned pilots never to fight with fuel still in that tank. But manuals could not account for emergencies, surprise attacks, or mistakes made under stress. If the drop tanks failed to feed at altitude, there would be no warning, no second attempt. The engine would simply starve. Every part of the system had to work perfectly. If it did, the Mustang would rewrite the rules of the air war. If it didn't, pilots would run out of fuel deep inside Germany long after any chance of rescue had vanished. The solution was simple. That was what made it dangerous. For the pilots assigned to this mission, there was no long transition period. The Mustangs had arrived only days earlier. Some pilots had barely logged an hour in the aircraft. A few had even less. They were veterans, men who had survived dozens of combat missions, but they were learning this machine under the worst possible conditions. There was no time to ease into it. The bomber crews needed escorts now. Pilots studied fuel charts instead of tactics. They memorized switch sequences the way others memorized emergency procedures. Wing tanks, fuselage tank, drop tanks, internal fuel only for combat and the long flight home. Miss one step, and the rest of the mission didn't matter. They knew the risks. The Mustang flew beautifully when everything was balanced, but a full fuselage tank made it tail-heavy and unpredictable. The manuals warned against it. Everyone understood why. But manuals were written in calm rooms, not at 25,000 feet with enemy fighters closing in. Below them, on the ground, the pressure was different, but no less real. Crew chiefs worked through the night in freezing temperatures, checking fuel lines, fittings, and pressure systems. They tested drop tank connections again and again, knowing that a failure wouldn't mean a rough landing or an aborted mission. It would mean an aircraft vanishing somewhere over Germany. They signed off on planes they would never fly themselves. There were no speeches on the flight line, no heroic language, just quiet professionalism. A nod, a thumbs up. A final look at an aircraft disappearing into the dark. Every person involved understood the same truth. If the math was wrong, skill would not save them. Courage would not save them. Experience would not save them. But if the math was right, if every calculation, every switch, every tank performed exactly as designed, then something unprecedented was about to happen. For the first time, American fighters would not turn back. Tomorrow morning, theory would become reality. The Mustangs lift off one by one, climbing into a low gray ceiling that swallows them almost immediately. England disappears beneath cloud and mist as the fighters form up, wings flashing briefly when the sun breaks through. The climb is long and deliberate. Throttles are set carefully. Fuel selectors are watched as closely as the horizon. Every pilot knows the sequence by memory now, but no one treats it casually. The first mistake can happen early. They cross the English coast and push out over the channel, a long silver stream climbing higher, the bombers still somewhere ahead and above. The sea below is calm and empty, offering no comfort. There is nothing to land on here, no margin for failure. At altitude, switches are thrown. Fuel begins feeding from the external drop tanks. Gauges are checked again and again. The needles move as expected. Pressure holds. So far, everything is working. The French coast slides past beneath the clouds, then Belgium, then the Netherlands. Germany lies ahead. This is the point where previous escort missions always ended, the invisible line where fighters turned back, banking west while the bombers continued on alone. Every pilot knows exactly where that line should be. They cross it anyway. No one says anything over the radio. There's no announcement, no moment of ceremony. The formation simply keeps flying east. Minutes pass. Then, more minutes. Fuel continues to feed from the drop tanks, just as the calculations promised. The tension builds quietly. Pilots glance at their gauges, then back to the sky, then down again. Engines sound normal. Temperatures hold steady. The Mustangs feel heavy with the tanks still attached but stable, predictable. Still, no one relaxes. This is the most dangerous part of the mission. Not combat, not flak, but waiting. Waiting for a fuel pressure drop, waiting for an engine to cough, waiting for proof that something, somewhere, has gone wrong. Instead, the drop tanks keep feeding. Germany stretches out beneath them now, a patchwork of fields, rivers, and cities, sliding slowly past at 25,000 feet. The bombers are still ahead. The Mustangs are still with them. For the first time, American fighters are deep inside the Reich, and they are not leaving. The math is holding. For now. The first German fighters appear without warning. Dark shapes above the bomber stream, diving out of the sun. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs accelerating fast, closing the distance in seconds. This is familiar territory for them. They have done this dozens of times before. They expect the escorts to turn away. Instead, they find Mustangs climbing to meet them. The American fighters respond instantly. Throttles go forward, the Merlin engines surge, smooth and powerful, pushing the aircraft upward and ahead. The Mustangs don't dive defensively. They don't scatter. They climb directly into the intercept, positioning themselves between the bombers and the attackers. The German pilots hesitate. These fighters are higher than expected, faster than expected, and there are more of them than there should be this far into Germany. The first passes are brief and violent. Cannon shells streak past cockpits. Tracers arc through thin air. Fighters twist and roll, breaking away before collisions become inevitable. No one presses too hard yet. Both sides are testing, measuring, trying to understand what they're seeing. Then the realization begins to spread. The escorts are still here. The bombers continue east, steady and unbroken. The fighters remain with them, not drifting back toward the west, not conserving fuel, not fading from the fight. Each minute that passes confirms what German command does not yet believe. The gap is not opening. The Mustangs hold their positions, forcing the attackers to fight for every approach. German fighters that break through find American aircraft already waiting, cutting off angles, spoiling attacks before they can fully develop. After several minutes, the Luftwaffe disengages and climbs away, regrouping for another attempt. They have learned enough for now. This is not a normal escort mission. For the first time, American fighters have met them deep inside Germany, and they are not running out of sky. The flak begins before the city comes into view. Black bursts bloom in the sky ahead of the bomber stream, perfectly spaced, precisely timed. German gunners have calculated the altitude and speed of the formation. They know exactly where the bombers will be. There is no way around it. The aircraft fly straight into the barrage. Heavy shells explode close enough to rock entire formations. Shrapnel tears through aluminum skin. One bomber takes a direct hit and vanishes in a flash of fire and debris. Another falls out of formation trailing smoke, its fate already decided. Then the haze thins. Berlin appears below. It stretches to the horizon. Factories, rail yards, government buildings, endless blocks of concrete and steel. This is the heart of the Reich. The city American fighters were never supposed to reach, and yet they are here. The bombers open their bay doors and steady themselves for the bomb run, flying straight and level through flak and smoke. This is the most dangerous moment of the mission. They cannot maneuver, they cannot evade, they can only hold course and trust the escorts above them. The Mustangs are still there. German fighters attack again, this time in force, diving through flak and tracer fire to reach the bombers before the bombs fall. The American fighters meet them head-on, cutting across attack paths, forcing breakaways, turning the sky over Berlin into a twisting, violent maze of aircraft and fire. Bombs fall. The formations shudder as their loads drop away, aircraft suddenly lighter, climbing slightly as tons of explosives plunge toward the city below. Columns of smoke begin to rise almost immediately. Above it all, American fighters circle and fight, still guarding the bombers over the target itself. For German pilots watching this unfold, the impossible has already happened. Single-engine American fighters are not just near Berlin, they are fighting over it. At first, German command assumes the reports are wrong. Pilots call in sightings of American single-engine fighters over Berlin, fast, aggressive, operating in strength. The initial response is disbelief, misidentification perhaps, P-38s mistaken for something else, strays that wandered too far and won't make it home. That explanation lasts only minutes. More reports follow, then more. Different units, different sectors, all saying the same thing. American fighters are still there. They are not circling briefly and turning away. They are engaging German interceptors deliberately, repeatedly, over the capital itself. They are staying with the bombers through the flak and through the attacks, exactly where escorts have never stayed before. For experienced Luftwaffe commanders, the implications are immediate. If American fighters can escort bombers to Berlin and fight effectively over the target, then there is no safe zone left in Germany. The defense of the Reich has been built around the certainty that escorts would run out of fuel. That certainty is gone. Orders go out to investigate, senior officers take to the air themselves on subsequent missions, determined to see it firsthand. They expect confusion, they expect mistakes. Instead, they find Mustangs waiting for them, high, fast, and fully committed. The realization settles in quietly, without drama. This is not a one-time anomaly. It is not an accident. The Americans have solved the range problem. From this moment forward, every German city is vulnerable. The change does not happen all at once. There is no single battle where the Luftwaffe collapses, no dramatic announcement that the air war has been decided. Instead, the shift reveals itself over weeks, then months, as patterns begin to break down. American fighters no longer peel away at the edge of Germany. They stay with the bombers, on the way in, over the target, and on the way out. Every mission forces German interceptors to fight continuously, without the pauses they once relied on to regroup and recover. There is no longer a safe stretch of sky where bombers can be attacked without opposition. That changes everything. German pilots who once conserved fuel and ammunition for the escort gap are now forced into repeated engagements. They burn fuel faster. They take damage earlier. Aircraft that would once have returned safely now limp back to base riddled with holes or do not return at all. The attrition begins to tell. Experienced German pilots are lost faster than they can be replaced. New pilots arrive with fewer hours, less training, and almost no chance to learn under controlled conditions. Each mission strips away another layer of experience from the Luftwaffe. The Americans feel the difference immediately. Bombers still take losses, but they are no longer being destroyed wholesale. Formations stay intact longer. Damaged aircraft have a chance to survive because fighters remain overhead, breaking up attacks before they can concentrate. The escort is no longer as a temporary presence, it is constant. Every mile of German airspace becomes contested. Every interception turns into a fight the Luftwaffe cannot avoid and cannot disengage from at will. The balance that once favored the defender begins to swing, slowly, relentlessly, in the opposite direction. The air war has not ended, but for the first time, its outcome is no longer in doubt. By the spring of 1944, the effects are impossible to ignore. German fighter units are flying more missions for longer hours against an enemy that no longer leaves. Aircraft are lost faster than they can be repaired. Fuel shortages grow worse. Training programs are shortened, then stripped to the bare minimum, pushing inexperienced pilots into combat they are not ready for. The sky over Germany becomes a place of constant pressure. American fighters roam freely ahead of the bomber streams, beside them and behind them. Airfields are attacked, aircraft are destroyed on the ground, German pilots take off, already knowing they will be outnumbered before they ever see the enemy. By June, the Luftwaffe can no longer concentrate its strength. When the Allies invade Normandy, German air opposition is a shadow of what it once was. Fewer than 100 fighters rise to challenge thousands of Allied aircraft supporting the landings. The skies over the beaches belong entirely to the attackers. Ground forces fight without cover. Movements are spotted immediately. Supply columns are cut apart from the air. Every attempt to counterattack is exposed. The invasion succeeds not just because of what happens on the beaches, but because, in the months before it, the air war over Germany has already been lost. The moment American fighters reached Berlin, the countdown had begun. The consequences were unavoidable. The story of American fighters over Berlin is often told as a triumph of technology. A better engine, a better aircraft, a faster fighter. Those things mattered. But they are not why this worked. The Mustang did not win the air war by itself. It was not a miracle machine. It was part of a system, and that system finally functioned as a whole. The real breakthrough was range, not achieved through exotic materials or revolutionary design, but through practical decisions made under pressure. Extra fuel carried in fragile drop tanks, fuel systems that demanded discipline and punished mistakes, solutions that looked crude, even temporary, but solved the problem that mattered most. And behind every aircraft was a chain of people. Engineers who accepted compromises instead of perfection. Factory workers who built paper tanks by the thousands, knowing they would be used once and discarded. Crew chiefs who worked through cold nights signing off on aircraft they would never fly, trusting calculations instead of guarantees. And pilots who climbed into machines they barely knew, flying farther than anyone expected, because staying with the bombers mattered more than personal safety. This is how wars are actually won, not by a single battle, not by a single aircraft, but by systems that outproduce, outlast, and overwhelm the enemy. When American fighters appeared over Berlin, it shocked the Luftwaffe because it shattered an assumption they had built their entire defense around. The escorts were supposed to leave. The bombers were supposed to be alone. They weren't anymore. From that moment on, the outcome of the air war was no longer a question of if, but when. The answer arrived a few months later, on the beaches of Normandy, under skies the Luftwaffe could no longer contest. If this story was worth remembering, consider supporting the work that keeps these moments from being forgotten. Because these weren't just machines in the sky, they were people, and they changed history. They